Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to learn a new language mechanism called a cond expression. Once we learn about cond expressions, we'll go back to learning design method material where we will make use of cond. First, let's look at an example that does not use cond to help understand why cond is useful. Here's the complete design of a function. We can read the signature, and it tells us that the function consumes an image and produces a string. And the purpose tells us in more detail that the function produces tall, square, or wide, depending on the width and height of I. And the three examples show us all three cases. A rectangle that's 20 by 40 produces tall, one that's 20 by 20 produces square, and one that's 40 by 20 produces wide. And if we look at the actual function definition and read through it, it says that for a shape I, if the width is less than the height, produce tall. Otherwise, if the width equals the height, produce square, and otherwise produce wide. And that makes sense. That seems like what this function should do. One thing you could see here is that following our how to design functions process results in a bit of program that's quite easy for us to read. We could quickly look at this design for shape and know what it's supposed to do. Now let's talk about the motivation for cond. If we look at this function, there are really three separate cases. The case where we produce tall, the case where the width is the same as the height and we produce square, and the case where we produce wide. But if is what we call a two-armed conditional. It just has a true answer and a false answer. In functions like this, where we need three cases, we end up having to nest the if. We have an if inside one of the branches of the if. That's somewhat cumbersome for cases like this. And it just gets worse if there's more than three cases. Now let's look at cond expressions. In general, a cond expression looks like this. Open paren, cond, and then any number of question-answer pairs, enclosed in brackets this way. It may be easier to understand a specific use of cond than it is to understand the general case. So let's look at what the shape function would look like if we rewrote it with cond. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by commenting out the old definition of shape. I'll do that by putting a sharp sign and a semicolon here in front of the definition of shape. And what that's going to do is to comment out the entire following definition, or it would come out an entire following expression if it was just an expression there. Now I'll paste in a copy that I already had of the definition of shape using cond, and I'll also comment out this note I made about the general form of cond. So here we go. Here's shape rewritten using a cond. Let's read it. It says there's three cases. Here's the first case. In the first case, the question is the width of I less than the height of I? And the answer is tall. In the second case, the question is the width of I equal to the height of I? And the answer is square. And in the third case, there's a special question, else, which just means if you get to this question-answer pair, produce the result of evaluating this answer expression. So that's kind of an intuitive understanding of how cond works. Let's now go look at the evaluation rules for cond and understand how it works in a bit more detail. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this is set myself up to use the stepper to walk through the evaluation of this cond. So let me start by saving this file. And then what I've got here is a call to shape that I'd already saved. So here I'm saying shape of a rectangle that's 40 wide and 20 high. So that rectangle is wide. So that should make us go through all the cases of the cond. Now what I'm going to do is start stepping it. And I'll make the stepper a little bit bigger so it's easier to see what's going on. And there we go. We've got the function shape and we've got a call to shape right here. And before I really get going, I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to go over here to the course website, and I'll go to the mechanisms page, and I'll scroll down to the evaluation rules for cond. Here's the evaluation rules for cond. And what I'm going to do is take a snapshot of that. There we go. And now when I go back to the stepper, I could take that snapshot and set it right over top of, or right next to the stepping window, so we can see the rules for cond when we need them. Okay, now let's get going. So the first thing we have is a call to the function shape. And because of the call to a function rule, the first thing Racket has to do is evaluate the arguments to shape, and that's why that argument is highlighted in green. And the result of evaluating that call to rectangle is, of course, this red rectangle here. The purple just means this is the thing that Racket just substituted. So it replaced the call to rectangle with its result. This is what we would write down as our next evaluation step. So now that's on the left, and on the right, Racket puts, let me make this a little bit wider still, it might look a bit better. And on the right, Racket puts what it evaluates to. So this is a call to a function. We need to replace the call to the function with the body of the function in which every occurrence of the parameter I has been replaced by the rectangle, the red rectangle. And that's what we've got over here. This is the next thing we would write down if we were writing the step-by-step evaluation. Okay, let's take the next step. So now that whole cond is on the left, and Racket's highlighting the first thing it has to evaluate. Now, why is that the first thing it has to evaluate? Well, it's trying to evaluate the whole cond. And the question is, how does it evaluate the cond? Well, let's go look at the cond rules. There are 6 of them. The first one applies if there's no question-answer pairs. So that's not the case here. And the second one applies if the first question is else. And that's also not the case here. But the third one applies if the first question is not a value. And sure enough, here the first question is not a value. It's an expression. It's a call to the primitive less than. So Racket has to do what this cond rule says, which is to evaluate the question. So it has to evaluate this call to less than. And now evaluating the call to less than is something that we learned about last week already. We first have to evaluate all the operands, right? So we have to evaluate this call to image width. That's why Racket has highlighted the image width in green. And when it evaluates that, it gets 40, and it shows us on the right that it's replaced the call to image width with the 40. Then it evaluates image height and gets 20. Then it evaluates the actual less than and gets false. And now Racket has completed the third rule, which is it replaced the original cond question with the result of evaluating the question, which is false. Now cond is back to evaluating the whole cond, because now it has a cond whose first question is false. That's the 5th cond rule. So now it has a cond whose first question is false. And the rule says, if the first question is false, drop the first question-answer pair. And that's what's happened here on the right. There's 3 cond question-answer pairs on the left, but there's only 2 on the right, because Dr. Racket dropped the first one. Now we keep going, and now we're in a situation like we were with the first cond question. The first question is not a value, so it needs to be evaluated and replaced with its value. So I'll go a bit more quickly here. Image width of the rectangle is 40. Image height of the rectangle is 20. Equal of 40, 20 is false. So now we replace the question with false. And now we have a cond whose first question is false. And again, that's the 5th rule. We drop the first question-answer pair. And that's what's happened here. We now have a cond with a single question. So now we have a cond whose first question is else. That's the 2nd rule. And that rule just says replace the entire cond with the first answer. And that's what happened here. The entire cond has been replaced with the first answer. And that's the result of calling shape with that red rectangle. So here you see the step-by-step evaluation rules for con, and you could see what you would write down if you were asked to do a step-by-step evaluation. It's really important to know how to use the step-by-step evaluation rules, because for more complicated programs, you're sometimes going to need to understand exactly how it works step by step, and that can also be useful if you're debugging a program that isn't doing what you expected. What I'd like you to do now is to take this problem. Here's a function, a simple function definition, and a call to that function, and hand step the execution of this. So write each of the execution steps using the evaluation rules. I'll put the evaluation rules back on the screen for you here. And once you've worked this problem and written the whole thing out, start the video again, and I'll walk you through my answer. So here's my answer to the problem. We started with mag of 0. So that's a call to a defined function. And the first step is to replace the entire call to the function with the body of the function in which every occurrence of the parameter n has been replaced by the argument 0. So that gives us this. Now we have to evaluate a cond. Well, we have a cond, and we're doing the last rule of the cond, so we have to evaluate the first question. Well, when we evaluate the first question, we get false. Greater 0, 0 is false. So now we have a cond in which the first question is false. The rule for a cond when the first question is false is just to drop that question-answer pair. So this gives us a cond with one fewer question. Now we have a cond in which the first question is an expression. So we'll evaluate this expression. Well, less than 0, 0 is false, so we replace that question with false. Now we have a cond in which the first question is false. So the rule for a cond when the first question is false is to drop that question-answer pair. So now we have a cond with just one question-answer pair, the last one. The rule for a cond in which the first question is else is to replace the entire cond with the first answer. So now we have 0, and that's a value, and we stop there. So that's it for cond. Cond is a many-armed conditional. You can have as many conditional branches as you want, as many question-answer pairs as you want. You can use cond to do the kinds of things you do with if. It can have just 2 questions, but you can also use it to have many more questions.